of hay between,
which, just curious
between
to
two
get, I want to
vowels
get an answer from him.
is in the pronunciation of this period.
Yeah.
We have it in the Nash already. This is the way they were talking.
Yeah, but in the Genesis Apocryphon, you got both spellings.
Okay.
Right.
You know, 2134, you have the same spelling as this. But in the next column, column 22, you have it with the hay several times.
Right.
Yeah.
Father Fitzmyer, I just wanted to get. What if it turns out that the other brother is a famous rabbi, for example? What would you say to that? Would that speak to you that maybe that?
Well, then maybe that's the reason why he's identified as the brother of somebody.
Yeshua is a famous rabbi.
If it's Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah.
No, but
That's a big if.
No, but if the other one's a famous rabbi, would that speak to you, lead you to believe that maybe this is that famous rabbi, Jesus?
Well, it's possible. But you
One
got to
of-
prove
one of
to
the-
me that it's the same Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth.
One of the problems, as someone is saying, that you have, particularly in the high priestly family, toponymy operating. That is the
Named after the grandfather.
naming the child after the grandfather. So you get, let's say, Shimon Yohanan, Shimon Yohanan, and so on down, generation after generation.
You have that here with Joseph. You have this here with Yaakov.
And you have this here.
Yaakov bar Yosef bar Yaakov.
The Onayad house, you remember, has
Yeah.
toponymy operating, generation after generation. So we don't know which Onias is at the inscription. And
Of course, there was the other of the tradition too that is not adopted by Ashkenazi Jews today, where it's the same as this father. Father and son have the same name. Ananas.
I thought that was not proper in Jewish tradition to have the
Not in
unless the father's
Ashkenazi.
dead.
That's correct. But I'm saying that it's different. In the first century, you have.
Would it generally be the case that they name the first one? It's difficult to say. But is this more weathered than the average ostrich?
So it's much simpler.
The weathering, is that more so?
It's more.
Oded, make some room for Professor Lemire. I want to get him in the show. No, you guys stay there. Stay there. I just want to get Steve.
This one is the original crake, actually, which.
It went so far. I didn't check the Bible.
That's same as me, you know. And actually, he found another one here. It's very difficult to see, but now that he mentioned it, I can see the beginning. There is something. Oh, no.
With the light on the
Yeah,
side.
now with the light, it's better. Now you can look at it and see. Yes, now it's
1 hour.
Yes, that's good. You can see it.
I could only see the two circles. I don't see anything. I don't see anything.
We need really a special light.
By the way, I think that the lead
It's upside down.
It's upside down.
I saw the man putting it, and we had the newspaper, the television people, and he put it on.
So that makes a
Next week,
Could we have a good picture with a resin light or to see exactly the colorings? Maybe there is something in the middle. It's difficult.
we haven't seen it. But
stay away from the medieval.
Doesn't kerning usually mean that
In modern together.
sometimes there is
sometimes, you see this one.
which one of them?
From our own collection, it has 3 and 2.
And sometimes you have something which resembles menorah or it's as if it's a palm tree in the middle of mountain.
very clear. This is one.
I see that.
Yes. The other one is here.
More difficult, yeah.
If I shine the light here, now you see at 8 o'clock, now is the petal, is the point.
Okay.
But you know the original crack was not as wide as it is.
No, you know what happened was because we had to take it completely apart. And inside the crack was a lot of ancient corrosion. I mean, the crack has been at least 1,000, if not 2,000 years old.
I see.
Because the buildup of the incrustation inside was quite thick. In order to mend it, she had to clean that this incrustation, but which is kept in a, as I say,
Where
in a
are the
bundle.
fossils now? Have you taken anyone, each one?
Well, if I asked your permission that we would look under the
Yeah, it might
microscope
be
to
interesting.
see
Yeah.
this. There are, for instance, there were tiny root hairs, which are fossilized, calcified.
Go on the other side. Sorry, excuse me. How do you feel? This has been sitting on your balcony in your living room. How do you feel seeing it over here?
Well, I'm excited to see it again, especially after I heard about the cracks that it went through. What actually I see here for the first time are some of the ornamentations that I couldn't recognize. I saw only the circles, but now for the first time Ed assisted me to look. There are two rosettes at this side, and he mentioned to me that they found also some fossils within the crake. The crake itself is probably originated maybe even 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's quite difficult to find out, but maybe in future you will be able to examine the fossils. The work itself looks very nice. I mean, the conservation work, I think that Eva did a very nice job. And I like the way that they preserve actually you can see even where the cracks were. I'm sure that she could cover it in such a way that no one could see it with a naked eye. But I think it's the right way to do it. I also think that preserving the original crake is a good idea. It could be covered as well, but I think that's the right way how to show it, because that's how it was found, and that's the way that it should be preserved for future.
Great. So keep watching. Go in the corner there. See if there's a nicer way.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Doing a tilt down from
Yeah, that's
some
what
of
I was
that.
thinking. Yeah, it's on the writing.
Pick one. I mean, pick one, Sim.
Well, here it says James over there, right over everybody. James identity or
I can't
something.
see quite clearly there. I can see the firstborn. You like that?
Ladies and gentlemen, you're not the only wonderful scholars. For 30 seconds, be wonderful actors. Instead of just standing there and we can't see anything, if you can kind of mill about for a bit. 30 seconds, we promise it won't look fake, even though it looks fake.
That's good. That's good.
Could be just the
Even for the.
Why didn't you do it?
Okay, thank you. Just even. Now see what I mean? Yeah. It looks just as, you can tell it's as deep as the rest of it. That's the trick of light, and that's why you have to have multiple photographs.
When I saw it in the dull light of the unpacking room, I didn't even know which side had the inscription. So I mean, they did a fantastic job.
No, they did a wonderful job. What I'm saying is, any one light angle, you're going to lose some of the
critics have said that the last few letters are not very deep, but actually, Kyle's saying, depending on the light, they probably
Ossuary 570 might be the signature of the artist, not the deceased.
Fortunately, you see the more important words actually, the brother of.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
There is no doubt whatsoever. I mean,
Well, I don't think that there's two hands involved.
there is
I
no
think
two
it's
hands.
one hand.
Yeah, that's
And my question is, why does it
You don't find that the first one, because it's going through the letters and stuff. Because I made some my answer to this was that when someone started doing it, and they start with people.
Well, to my mind, the first part, the right-hand part, I think that's the station is not just
Yeah. Well, it is. You can see some scratches on this thing here. If you just try to put.
See, there's other signs.
the other side is more brownish. And the brown is going.
just brush it off.
The more interesting thing, I think, is to look at it in the daylight. Have you seen it in the daylight? In the daylight, you don't see any.
Yeah.
It doesn't come sharp at all.
Yeah, here the lights very carefully.
Yeah.
It's probably also a question of shadow or things like that.
That's how we do it.
Doesn't hold up at all.
Maybe,
I mean, I'm saying I don't see. It's a great difference, frankly.
Yeah, no, I mean,
How do you count the differences between the way the unit is done in the first section and then a nice period or whatever it is, the second version? What I found was that between the aleph and the ayin, it washed out completely. The aleph and the ayin are deep, as are uniformly all the first letters, and they keep their form, but all the rest gets washed out. Yeah. For what it's worth, it's not scientific, but
It shows something about light, maybe, or the way the lights.
Blood brothers, the Orthodox are going to say half brother, and the Roman Catholics are going to say kin. What are you going to do about it?
That's fair though.
Yeah. See, the other thing is that at the end of the article I have in America, I said,
I just.
no, I haven't.
And the leader was James, not Peter. Peter was overseas traveler, but James was the big honcho that he had to report back to. So he describes meeting him there, and then he describes a debate on the temple steps where the priests and the scribes are debating the James group on the steps, and there's a riot. And all of a sudden, into this riot bursts who's called an angry man, and it's clearly meant to be Paul in his time when he's serving the Roman authorities. And he runs into this debate just when James is about to win, picks up a flagon from the altar and beats James with a club and throws him down the stairs and leaves him for dead. And there's a huge melee, and about 30 people are dead, but James isn't dead. This is the kind of detail this novel has. It carries him out of the temple and to a house in Jerusalem, which is also good detail. Then it takes them down to Jericho, outside, and then the enemy, as he's called, gets letters from the high priest to pursue the Christians to Damascus. That's the thing in Acts. That's where Acts picks up. You recognize that. So this is Paul. This is a representation. And he comes through Jericho on the way to Damascus, and he misses them, and they've carried James down there because he's the leader of the whole community. Anyway, they're out somewhere outside of Jericho. Guess where they are? Near Qumran. Near Qumran. Yeah, near Qumran. And so, that's the thing of James attacking Paul with it.
So you think this historical?
This is so detailed. What is it? What are they doing in Jericho? It is so rich in detail.
So Herschel didn't agree for you to do the article?
He didn't even know what I was talking about. He doesn't know anything.
Okay.
What do you get in your novel, sir?
He didn't want...
Because speed. Okay, let's start with the ossuary. So it's the real thing?
No, it is not the real thing. It's a very questionable thing. It's very worrisome, highly suspicious. Many aspects to it are challenge credulity.
Why?
Why? Well, there's a whole list of things. First, there's no secure provenance. Second, there's no secure chain of custody. Third, it comes willy-nilly out of nowhere. Suddenly appears on the scene just when James is being talked about. You know, for the last 5 years, there have been a series of books on James, primarily including my own, which is a 1,000-page Penguin, James, the Brother of Jesus. And these books have been widely circulated. And in these books, one of the things that's said is perhaps the best proof of Jesus' existence was the fact that he had a brother James. 3 or 4 years after statements like this are being widely read, here pops the sarcophagus. That's the first thing that put my hackles up to worry about. It's the miraculous sudden appearance of this. The next thing, if you want me to continue?
Yeah.
Okay. The next thing that is worrisome about this box is the phrase, the brother of Jesus. Nobody at that time would have thought to put the brother of Jesus on an ossuary, not in the first century. Now, later, perhaps, after Christianity and its documents had time to dig in. The point was, James was rarely called this. James was famous in his own time. James was an overarching figure in Jerusalem known as the Just One. People used to walk up to James and touch his clothes as a holy man when he walked through the streets. He was probably a leader of a movement like the Essenes, if not the Essenes. Anyway, he was a tzaddik who everyone admired and knew about. Therefore, if you had an ossuary in his name, you wouldn't have to identify him brother of Jesus. He would be known in his own right. And it's like the person who added brother of Jesus wants us to know which James this was. So a later generation, or even someone in our own time, that's what I've said generally. That's too pointed. It's too perfect. It's like, oh, hello, 20th century. Do you want to know who this is? It's the brother of Jesus, you know, and someone's written it out there. That's a second problem. But I would even worry about a third problem. The James, the son of Joseph, Jacob, the son of Joseph, the first part. Now I'll get to that in a moment. That's not to say the two problems with the inscription itself. Now, we had professional paleographers supposedly looking at this. Look, I want to tell you, even an amateur could see that there are two hands there and that the two parts of the inscriptions don't match. One is deeply incised in a formal style. When I saw it in the museum, I was staggered because the pictures don't do it justice. The pictures looks like they've been sort of, enhanced because you can hardly read the second part because it's so dim and it's done with such a clumsy tool. The first part just jumps right out, and it's not just because it's been clean. It's been done with a different, more precise tool. It's a formal hand. The second part is clearly added by a second hand with a different instrument even. It's not as deeply incised. It's more clumsily. It's like just a more clumsy instrument. Now, an amateur paleographer could tell you that. But the public is cowed. The public defers to these specialists and is unwilling to use its own judgment. So there are two parts to this inscription. Now, I've dealt with the second part a little bit. The first part is worrisome for the following reasons. Okay, there may be 200 or 300 people called Jacob the son of James in the area of Jerusalem at this time. I wouldn't even want to estimate how many there might be.
You mean Jacob son of Joseph?
Jacob son of Joseph, right. I mean, yeah. Maybe 200, 300. There may be 200, 300 people in the Jerusalem or its environs at this time called Jacob the son of Joseph. But the problem with this particular inscription is that it is too clean. It is too new. There are rosettes in the back of the ossuary that are rubbed out. Where is the wear from nature? Where is forget the patina argument. People have said on both sides of that, I'm not an expert on patina, that it can be faked. I've heard from a lot of antiquities people that this is normal practice in the unfortunate market of unreliable antiquities, that this is happening in a widespread way. But in any case, put the patina argument aside. Where is the natural wear and tear on that particular inscription that you see, for instance, on the rosettes on the other side and the inscription on the left? Now, the final part of that, James, the son of Joseph, which is worrisome. No ancient sources really call James the son of Joseph. In fact, they try to make a point that Joseph isn't the father. That he's not only not the father of James, he's not even the father of Jesus. God is supposed to be the father of Jesus. And I've always thought that the term Joseph was a symbolic term, going back to who Jesus' tribal father was. That is, Joshua's tribal father, as you probably know, was the tribe of, Joshua's tribal father was the tribe of Joseph. It's Joshua, son of Joseph. Also in Jewish culture, we have two Messiahs, the Messiah ben David and the Messiah ben Joseph. And this seems to fit in with those kinds of allusions. In the actual text, we hear that James is the son of Clopas and Mary, or someone called Cleopas and Mary. Another document in the Gospels calls him James the son of Alphaeus, a corruption of Cleophas. So we have lots of names whom James may have been the son of. This Cleophas character, you see, is how the Gospel of John uses this character to develop the idea that James is not really a brother of Jesus, but his first cousin. Because in the Gospel of John, it says, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and her son, James, Joses, Simon, and so on, the four sons, and the daughter Salome. So normally in the tradition, James is considered the son of the uncle, Clopas, Alphaeus, unless Clopas and Alphaeus are Joseph. So even the Joseph part from a specialist, who I consider myself to be, and honestly, the people we're talking about may be specialists in paleography or patina, but they're not specialists in history and text, and they don't know these traditions. Those are many of the reasons why I worry about this inscription.
But on that...
Sorry for that long-winded response.
No, we can edit.
I'm sure.
Where are you? I'm good. Are you good? Yeah. Does he need to turn towards me a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah. Stop.
This way.
Stop.
What I'm getting is, because of all the movement, I'm getting some...
I move. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. No, I'm getting some glasses hit the lights. That's the
I mean, I'll take them off if you want.
Do you see without them?
I can see you. But we've done this much with them. Come on, might as well continue.
Oh, yeah, put the glasses on.
I'm handsomer with the glasses.
So it's only now and then that I get it, depending.
Covers up my ugly eye insets.
So you okay?
Yeah, it's good.
So, I'm not a scholar on this matter, but I thought there were two Jameses. There was a Cleophas, and he's seems to be a cousin. There's a bunch of Jameses.
Cleophas is supposed to be the brother of Joseph.
Of Joseph. So that doesn't preclude the idea that Joseph also had a son named Yaakov.
Well, let's not get too Byzantine about this. I mean, you know, we get multiplication of Marys, multiplication of James's, multiplication of John's, and the main reason for that is, it's in my book, if your viewers read it, is as the doctrine of the supernatural Christ went forward into the 2nd century, brothers became cousins, fathers became uncles, mothers even turned into their own sister. You know, in the Gospel of John, we get Mary, the sister of Mary, which is a tautologist impossibility. But that's how John has the character, Mary, the sister of the mother of God. So Mary is not even the mother of God in John, because John is pushing the family away from Jesus as the supernatural Christ, and the perpetual virginity of Mary came into being. So I wouldn't worry about this multiplication of like-named persons. I sort through all that.
But if there was, I mean, to you, is Jesus a historical figure?
He is an historical figure insofar as his brother is an historical figure. Jesus is an historical figure insofar as his brother is an historical figure. You know, I said in the article I wrote recently, it isn't the question whether Jesus has brothers, there for sure. It's the question whether the brothers have a Jesus. And what I meant by that is, Jesus is historical, but the documents about him may not be reliable. The problem is the documents about him are so beloved, so much part of our culture, that people have a knee-jerk reaction to them. Oh, Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary. All these are like shibboleths, platitudes of our society. The point is that there certainly was a Jesus, but what we know about him is very dim and indistinct, and those documents were written a good deal further along in time, and often retrospectively, and with an agenda. They were written primarily from a Pauline Gentile Christian point of view to make the Jesus figure, in typical Hellenistic writing, the writers claim the figure, the way Plato claimed Socrates, make the Jesus figure more or less a mouthpiece for their position. So I don't accept the narrative picture of Jesus. I do think that the picture of James would be very much like what Jesus would have been.
So in a way, to get to the historical Jesus, you have to go through James.
There you go. Once you've solved the problem of the historical James, you have willy-nilly, you've got the end of my book. Solve the historical Jesus. The last sentence in my book read, who and whatever James was, so was Jesus. Because these two brothers were obviously very close. One succeeded the other. The other died much, much earlier. The facts about him have been overwritten by all kinds of theological and other Gnostic tendencies over several centuries until we finally get the potpourri in the final form we call the Gospels. These Gospels develop in the form we know them over 2 or 3 centuries. There may be early parts to them, but there are much later parts too. So that's retrospective writing. It's sort of like going to Hollywood and telling the script writer, now you write the script, here are the basic details from that perspective. So one writer will write it from that perspective, another writer will write it from this perspective. If I were the writer, I'd be writing it from the Jamesian perspective. That gospel hasn't been written yet.
Given all these...
Oh, let me throw one other thing, if I could, in that. This is a really important point. You might be able to get some use out of it, because I want to pop it in. You ready? Let me throw one important thing in on that. You know, those of us who know how important James was and what an overarching, he was the tzaddik of his generation. Everyone deferred to him, all parties. He was like the Ayatollah of his period, I would say. I don't like to call him that. Or even the bin Laden of his period. I don't think he was that violent. He's called the righteous, so I don't think he was an unjust man. But that's the stature he would have had among all the opponent groups. They circulated around him. Now, I don't need an ossuary to prove to me the importance of James. I already knew the importance of James, and those of us who have been writing about him for 20, 30 years have no doubts about this. The public at large is only just hearing of him. But what bothers me about this whole debate is the fact that the people who have discovered this, they don't really care about James. They're not interested in James. They were no more interested in James now than they were beforehand. All they're doing is using the ossuary to prove the existence of Jesus. The point I made in Roman numeral 23 of my book in 1997, that the best proof of Jesus' existence was the fact of a brother James. James could care less about James. That offends us. We feel you should be looking at James. James is the key person in this time and place, and here we have, if it's an authentic ossuary, a wonderful evidence of him. Let's get into the James thing. Let people learn about James. It's a rich history and an exciting history, and they will be challenged, and they will be extended, and they will not be sorry for having discovered this marvelous person.
Why do you think that James, if Jesus is overlaid with all kinds of stuff, script writing, why do you think James is more accessible than Jesus?
Because nobody cared about James. Nobody cared to overlay him with anything. He was like shunted aside, marginalized. You know, he was the head of the movement in Palestine, where the Paul-Peter axis took over the movement overseas. Now, you know some Jewish history, I'm sure, and you know that after the disappearance of the Jerusalem Center in the war in 66 to 70, ending in Masada in 73, there was no more Jerusalem Center of revolutionary activity, I mean. All that, and these groups, I would call them messianists at this point. They're not Christians yet. Paul says, quoted in Book of Acts, that Christians were first called Christians in Antioch in Syria. That's northern Syria in 55. So it was overseas they got the name Christians. In Palestine, at this time, they were never called Christians. What were they called? Well, in my work, we think they're called Essenes, Zealots. Some early Christian work says that the Zealots and Essenes were combined. There were Zealot Essenes, and there were Sicarii Essenes. A Sicarii Essene would be the most extreme, a terrorist Essene. Most people think of Essenes as little, pietistic people praying and doing nothing else. No, they were very aggressive Essenes, as the Dead Sea Scrolls show. And these terrorist Essenes were perhaps the worst group. I think James was the tzaddik for all these groups, sort of like the grandfather of the mountain, the bin Laden, for all of these groups around which all these groups revolved, but they were all opposed to Roman power in Palestine. That's why they were all liquidated.
The term zealot, some people argue that that's a much later term.
Josephus doesn't use the term right away. He calls it the fourth movement in his work. Well, these are very specialized questions. But by the time of the takeover of the temple, he's calling one group among them zealots. The actual group, probably the James group, because this is the group that actually killed the high priest that is responsible for the death of James. And you see in a sequentiality there, like-minded groups have like enemies. The group, excuse me, I'll pick up there. The group that occupied the center part of the temple under Eleazar in the 60s, Josephus starts to call zealots. Earlier he called them many other names, but zealot, he is using that. And he also is using Sicarii from the 50s. And the Sicarii, are the ones who take over Masada. We consider them zealots, but they're actually Sicarii, a more extreme group of zealots. But it's all part of the same tree. But these zealots in Jerusalem, in the middle of the war, who are occupying the temple, there are three different parties all fighting with each other, but these are occupying the temple. They're the ones, with the help of these violent Gentiles, the Idumeans as they're called, rampage through the city, kill all the high priests, which shows it's an anti-priestly uprising, including the one responsible for the death of James, Ananus ben Nanus, who I think that they actually, Josephus says they desecrated his body and threw it out of the walls without clothes, naked as food for jackals. They didn't have a great high affection for him. And I think they actually urinated on his body and things like that before they threw it out in the city. This was the desecration, and probably cut off a few sexual parts in the process. And this is part of what the viciousness they felt towards this person, the killer of James. It was a tough time.
These are early Christians we're describing?
Christians? Well, there are no Christians in Palestine at this time. I just made that point. Christians is something as an overseas movement. It develops in northern Syria, in Egypt, in Asia Minor. Christians don't exist in Palestine before the fall of the temple. These are parties, Jewish parties, extreme. You want to call the Dead Sea Scrolls Christian? They're not Christian, but we have to speak about them. People say, oh, Eisenman, you call the Scrolls Christian. I don't call the Scrolls Christian. I have to use vocabulary that exists. These are extremist Jewish groups, messianists. That's what these groups are, messianists. Later on, messianists gets pacified in the Roman Pax Romanum and turns into what we call Christianity. In other words, its fangs are defanged. You want to know how its fangs are defanged? Read Paul, Romans 13. There, Paul tells you that the God has given favor on behalf, judgment on behalf of the Roman Empire. Those are the officials that we must obey, that the wearing of the sword bears its own reward, and you should pay your taxes to Rome because that's what God demands of you. Now, this is a new law, not Jewish holy law, which in the Temple Scroll says you shall not put a foreigner over you. Paul says you should pay your taxes to Rome, and you know the final thing that he uses to justify it all? Because you should love your neighbor as yourself. This is the key James passage, the royal law of Scripture in the letter of James, love your neighbor as yourself. Paul applies it to paying Roman taxation. That shows how cynical he is. That shows how he's laughing at these groups. He had a total contempt for these groups. He takes the most precious documents and turns it into a collaborationist exercise of, oh, you want to know? This is why you should pay taxes, because you should love the Romans as yourself. This is an incredible period, which is why I pray and hope that people who care about this period, religious people and non-religious people, will get deeper into it, because there's so much more out there to challenge them, and they're just being given the scratch of the top of the surface. Back to the Ossuary.
Leave the Ossuary for one second.
You don't want all this stuff in your thing, huh?
Sure, I want to understand James for the, if we're going to deal with the Ossuary. What?
You asked me to pause or?
No, it's all right. We're just chatting. It's okay.
Let's see if I'm going to say how I understand.
Simca's a good questioner.
I'm going to tell you how I think your thesis runs, and then you tell me, nah, it's not true, or yeah, or whatever. It's just to get people can't hear my questions.
That's all right. I like your questions.
Yeah, okay, so.
You're better than the interviewer yesterday.
Okay, good.
He had a cloth.
Oh, okay. Here's my thing. I think what I got from, I haven't finished your book.
I dare say.
What I got is this. There's a historical Jesus, and there's a mythical.
Mythologized
Yeah,
Jesus.
mythologized. The mythologized Jesus is universal. He's above the law. He loves Gentiles.
Right. He eats with prostitutes and sinners.
Yeah,
he does tax collectors.
The historical Jesus, on the other hand,
He multiplies loaves and fishes.
And all these parochial Jews, they're little, they're into the law, they're this and they're that, and they don't understand Jesus among them. In reality, if you want to get to the historical Jesus, you go to James, and what you find out, it's the opposite. It's the guys who are against Jesus that are actually the universalists, if you will. They're Hellenized, they're collaborating with the Romans.
Right.
And the historical Jesus is actually parochial, zealot,
right.
Into the law, into the is that
right, exactly. You're exactly extreme.
Okay,
That's exactly.
You summarize kind of your thesis like this.
Well, it's hard because you see, it took me a long time to develop the thesis. Yeah, but you're smarter than me. You're a lot smarter than me. You know, I mean, it's all swim. Oh, not me. Look, the thesis is that by doing the search for the historical James, you're not only going to find James, you're going to also understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls were and come to the true picture of this period. Let me give you an example, including who Jesus had to have been, because he couldn't be the person Paul. Paul's view of Jesus is determined. First, he never met him, and he admits that. Second, he persecuted Christians, and he admits some unto death. It's part of my thesis in my book that Paul had a hand in the death of John the Baptist. And you'll see why, because they're both in the same place on missions at the same time, and Paul is on a mission to one of John the Baptist's enemies at that time. He only has a contact with a supernatural Christ in heaven, as he calls him, Christ Jesus in heaven. Paul has apocalypsios. It's the Greek word for vision. He has visionary spirits, visionary experience of a Christ Jesus in the clouds. He never met the earthly Jesus, so his Jesus is the heavenly Jesus. That Jesus tends to be a reflection of his own persona and the doctrines that Paul thinks that Jesus should have preached. But, that's why he was laughed at by the people in his own time. He said, who is this Johnny-come-lately? Who is this newcomer? Who is this bounder? But he had certain advantage of them. He was well educated. He was a Pharisee. He came from an upper-class family, probably a very, very wealthy one. He had a Roman citizenship. He wasn't a simple little fisherman or a cobbler or something like that. He had it all over them, and he took them to the cleaner in his discussions. They couldn't hold a candle to him. But he is extremely cynical. Now, going over to the other part, take this doctrine, this document that's recently been labeled MMT. You've heard of that. It's a letter, presumably from the head of the community to a king of some kind. It's a very convoluted letter. It's the only letter among the Qumran corpus. It's probably from the righteous teacher to some king. Well, it depends when you think the righteous teacher lived. I think the righteous teacher lived in the 1st century. I give a lot of reasons for thinking that, and it's too complicated for this discussion. But if you look at that carefully, you'll see that that letter contains the actual directives James makes in the book of Acts to overseas communities. It makes it, though, from an unfamiliar way, not from the smoothed-up, Hollywoodized, a slick way Acts presents these things in 3 points: abstain from blood, things sacrificed to idols, strangled things, and fornication. In MMT, it's convoluted. Things sacrificed to idols is a subject of about 70 lines, not taking things sacrificed to idols. Fornication is another 20 or 30. Blood is assumed. Carrion appears in certain of the intuitions there. So that letter would be a parallel to James's letter to overseas communities delivered to northern Syria. So what is my conclusion? You'll take a Qumran document, it'll look so alien and so abstruse that you won't see it as a Christian document. But in fact, that's the original. The other's been a good interviewer.
Are we rolling?
I'd like to do it with him because he's tough. He gets you moving in the areas you didn't want to get into.
Okay, so if you could summarize, what after all this study, all this thinking about this stuff, what's the fundamental difference between the mythologized Jesus and the real Jesus?
The problem is that people take literature as history and have an inability to distinguish between a work of literature, which the Gospels represent for the most part, and an actual history, which is what Josephus would give them, a nitty-gritty, down-the-earth, ugly, nuts and bolts history. So if you try to take the difference, in the Gospels you have the presentation of a miraculous figure who does miraculous things, for instance, who takes evil spirits, throws them in the swine run off the hillside and drown themselves, or walks on the water, or multiplies loaves and fishes, or turns water into wine. People love those episodes. Those are the dearest episodes in people's culture. There's no reason that they shouldn't, but that's not history. That is literature, or the dirty word, mythology. Those things, to the practical computer-linked up network person of the 20th century, never happened. That is part of the beautiful presentation of the most beautiful being in the world. Now, the history can be something rougher and more down to earth. I don't know the history of Jesus because it's been so overwritten with that sort of material. But the thrust of that sort of material is primarily, unfortunately, anti-Semitic, because all people understand Jesus except Jews, and Jews gnash their teeth at him. So the Jews are pictured in that literature as the blue meanies. And that has successfully engendered a wave of anti-Semitism in every generation up to the present, ending in the Holocaust. The seeds are in the picture. The people who put the seeds in were very clever. They were not Palestinian Jews, obviously. They were not self-hating Jews. They were overseas Gentiles who didn't like what the Jewish people represented and didn't like the doctrines about Christ. So that whole picture, to my mind, is, I hate to use the word, people will hate me for it, corrupted. That's where the scrolls come into play. The scrolls are an indigenous literature of the Messianic movement from a Palestinian viewpoint, which are not corrupted. They were not worked on by an editorial committee. They were put in the caves to save them, and they're like a time capsule. They remain for 20 centuries. That's why I'm so interested in these scrolls. So, what do I think Jesus was? Everything written in the scrolls. That is the kind, whether it's mentioned there or not, that is what the Messianic movement is: a nationalist, extremist, xenophobic, and very much law-oriented apocalyptic group. What do we get in the scripture we're familiar with for overseas? Very good proselytation documents, but largely in the interest of the Pax Romanum, and often the very reverse of everything we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yes, to my mind, Jesus has been reversed, turned in the very opposite of what he would have represented in Palestine as the Messianic popular leader there. Meaning he would not have been sitting with the prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors. He would have observed purity regulations to be a popular Messiah. He would have been anti-Roman. He would not have been talking to Roman governors and Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers would not have recognized him as the Messiah before Jews did. These are all documents aimed at proselytizing Roman soldiery and Roman governors, not Jewish people, and presenting Jews as the devil people. And the world has got the picture. Even bin Laden's got that picture.
Now, is that why James has been marginalized?
Absolutely. Because as James was written out, he's a philo-Semite, anti-Semitism was written in. That's exactly what happened. And you know there's a second James in the scripture. That's the multiplication of like-named characters. He's called James, the brother of, oh, not Jesus, John, the son of Zebedee. Oh yeah, John and James, the two sons of thunder, James, the brother of John. But that James, the brother of John, is conveniently eliminated from the book of Acts just when the real James is introduced into the book of Acts. And the interesting thing about him is that Paul doesn't even know him. Paul, a contemporary writer who knows all these people, Peter, James, and some of the others, never mentions James, the brother of John. So even in those problems, these multiplication goes on, and there may be, the multiplications can be explained by the marginalization and the pushing James aside because of the sort of messianism he represented was not cosmopolitan enough to do the job that those people were intending to do. Paul says, I believe in winning. I run the race to win. He says this in 1 Corinthians 6. All the runners at the race are fighting for a prize. I run for a prize that will never wither. That's how I fight, not beating the air. So he uses Roman stadium athletics to show the kind of way he approaches. I'm a Greek to the Greek, a Jew to the Jew, a lawkeeper to the lawkeeper, a lawbreaker to the lawbreaker. I will do whatever I have to do to win. And he wins. And these Jerusalem people don't have a chance against that kind of person. He is the first Lombardi. Winning isn't the only thing, it's everything. Or Al Davis, just win, baby. Paul is the first win baby of the beginning of the millennia, and he does win. But we would consider that a rather cynical approach to proselytization.
Now I spoke yesterday to one of the what's his name, the professor from Edinburgh, Balcom, and he said I played a little devil's advocate with him and did a little Eisenman with him. He says you can't on the evidence. James, Peter, Paul, they all got along like a house on fire. Yeah, they differed a little bit about, they didn't agree. The issue was not, of course, James thought the Jews shouldn't start breaking the law. That wasn't an issue. Wasn't an issue for Paul. They really, what was the relationship going to be between Gentiles and Jews? So they all got together. Everybody's making a big deal about factionalism. I don't see any factionalism, he says. Basically, they got along. They had little issues about how does the Gentile movement and the Jewish movement, sit at the same table. That's all. Eisenman and the rest of them are saying conflicts where there are no conflicts.
There's total conflict. All you have to do is look at Galatians, where Peter and Paul and the others are in this special place called Antioch, where Christians were first called Christians. By the way, I don't think it's a normative Antioch. I think it's this place in northern Syria, Syriac Antioch. There were 5 Antiochs. This is Edessa in northern Syria. I'm sure that's where it was. That's where things were going on. They were all called Antioch. But the point is, then the messengers of James came down with his instructions to oversee communities. And Paul himself admits that all of the people who used to keep table fellowship with Gentiles stopped doing it and withdrew because of the party of the circumcision. They call James's party the party of the circumcision and the messengers from James. Even Peter did this, and he said, and I accused him to his face and said, Peter, you are a hypocrite. And in any case, after that, Barnabas leaves Paul, and everyone shuns him from that moment on, and he will only travel with non-Jewish Gentile traveling companions like Timothy and others of that kind, Lucas, etc. So you tell me that's a minor dispute? That's a major dispute when people, all of his close companions, desert him and refuse to have anything to do with him. Now, if you look in Essene practice, the Essenes have a characteristic of shunning. They expel people from the community for various things, and then they shun him in work and activity. This is exactly what's going on here with Paul and the others in the Antioch scene, and it's clear that we're having quasi-Essene practice going on here of a very familiar kind. So these arguments are very deep. I will say one last thing about that. Paul constantly cavils against the chief apostles. He constantly says, who are these people? Pillars? Not that their importance means anything to me. He says things like men of knowledge. Are they men of knowledge? Then he makes some nasty comments and says they're not even able to tell the difference that an idol is nothing. They make trouble over eating food sacrificed to idols, one of the strictures of James's rulings. An idol is nothing in the world, he says. And then at the end of Corinthians 2, he said, Hebrews are they? So am I. Super apostles are they? So am I. You know, and he makes clear that the people who he's heaping abuse on are the super Jewish apostles who are over him, and he's constantly cavilling and making snide allusions to them that anyone in his right mind, except someone who wants to just make everything look rosy, would realize had to do with severe internal strife. The final thing he says in Galatians, he's talking to his communities and the super apostles coming and bothering them. What they're bothering them about is circumcision. And he says in one nasty outburst, tell those who are bothering you, I wish they would themselves cut off. Meaning I wish they would themselves, their own sexual parts cut off, making it look as if circumcision is cutting off your sexual parts, but also parroting the fact that Essenes expelled outsiders by cutting them off. So he does a double entendre there in the real ferocious antagonism he feels to these so-called Jamesian Jewish Christians who are insisting on circumcision.
So the infighting was real.
Severe. I think there is evidence that Paul is involved in some manner in the death of John the Baptist. Now, I don't want to make that sensationalist, but you can look at the trail and see that he was on a mission over to this king who was Herod the Tetrarch, and Herod the Tetrarch was arguing with...
just let's not go
yeah, no, it doesn't matter.
What do you think James and Paul felt for each other?
James didn't hate anybody. He wasn't that kind of person. He was the righteous one. He was a totally righteous person. Paul had envy for James. He had antagonism to James, and he literally probably wanted to destroy James. And when he was arrested in the 60s by the Roman governors and held in protective custody, even when Sicarii had taken an oath to kill Paul because of introducing Gentiles in the temple, what happens in Caesarea in Acts, which is now an historical part in Acts, not an overwritten, looks more like a debriefing session. And it's funny, no members of his community come down to visit him at all. And he's being housed in Agrippa I's palace there. And ultimately, they get him out of the country on a appeal to Caesar. But to have stayed in the country would have meant his death. There were so many people who wanted to kill him for what he. But they didn't want to kill James. James wasn't being hunted down or anything. James went on functioning as if nothing was happening while Paul was under arrest. Yes, I think that was very severe, even unto death. I think ultimately, this is way beyond where I would like to be. Paul, with his discussions with the Roman authorities, would have given information that led to the final demise of people like James.
Paul was a collaborator?
Paul could not have gone to Rome and then been freed in Rome, and the way he went, without entering Roman service of some kind, and he held a Roman citizenship. So he went to Rome in 62, the time just when James was killed in Jerusalem. You know, the book of Acts ends not with James's death, where it should end, the leader of the whole. It ends with Paul under loose house arrest in Rome, and it doesn't look like he's going to be executed then, because he's not executed for another 8 years, and the stories are that he goes on to Spain and elsewhere. I even think he came back to Palestine. In the meantime, there's a character Josephus described called Saul, who's a member of the Herodian family, who also makes an appeal to Caesar, and very definitely is in the service of the Roman authorities. So I don't say he's a collaborator. He's someone whose allegiances are worrisome.
Where does the tradition that he goes to Spain come from?
It's in, he mentions in one of his letters that he wants to go to Spain, and then some of the extra biblical material talks about his having gone to Spain. So if he went to Spain, and if he returned to Palestine, which I have a reason to believe he did, before he died around 68 in the midst of the uprising, the Romans had just rounded up all troublemakers by that time and executed everybody, and the dragnet would have included people like Paul by that point. But if he returned to Palestine, then he'd have to have entered service in some way, like Josephus did. Josephus went to Rome. When he came back, he was in Roman service. That's how he saved his skin. You cannot go to Rome and come back. You can't go to Stalinist Russia and come back. Free, I mean. You end up in the gulag.
Was there an ideological reason for them to want to schlep to Spain?
Well, I think the Roman emperors at that period came from Spain. Don't forget, you had Trajan coming in, you had Hadrian coming in, you had a lot of connections to Spain in the Roman imperial family at this time. He said he has very important contacts there he wants to follow up. And the future Roman emperors all came from Spain. After the death of, but you're getting way afield now.
Yeah, no,
He's just interested.
I was just curious about that. Well,
Let's go back to the ossuary.
Let's go to the ossuary.
Right.
You got an ossuary. You mentioned that he shouldn't even be in an ossuary.
We have strong traditions about the burial of James from early Christian sources, extra biblical sources. The first is by a Jewish Christian writer, someone who converted to Christianity in the 2nd century, who probably was already a mature person 50 years after the events in question. Second part of the 2nd century, his name is Hegesippus. He writes that, regardless of how mythologized his picture of how the stoning and the death of James took place, that just, I think he combines two things: the fall down the temple steps in the Pseudo-Clementines, that's the fall off the temple pinnacle that he talks about, and that's all in my book. I explain how these things are conflated. That's what takes the time in my book. The fall off the temple pinnacle, and then the hitting with the washerman's club to bash out his brains. That was the coup de grace given in all stonings. He always gave a coup de grace. So he was stoned down in the Kedron Valley below the pinnacle of the temple, and Hegesippus said he was buried where he was stoned. And a marker was put up there that is still there to this day. So he was buried. He was not laid out in a rock tomb, according to that report. Eusebius repeats that report in the 4th century. Eusebius is Constantine's bishop. He comes from Caesarea. He's a Palestinian. He knows Palestine traditions very, very well. He says it was still there in his time in the 4th century. Jerome repeats the tradition in the 5th century. So does Epiphanius. Epiphanius is a Palestinian who went to Cyprus. Jerome was a Roman who came to Palestine and spent his whole life in Jerusalem and Bethlehem compiling his version of the Latin Vulgate. He knew a lot of things, and he says that the burial marker in James's burial place was still there in the 5th century. So how does this record with there being an ossuary with 1st century Aramaic writing on it? It doesn't accord. So either all those traditions are wrong and are willy-nilly suddenly appearing fresh ossuary with the inscription on the wrong side of the box is authentic, and our paleographers, such as they are, who can't even tell the difference between two kinds of handwriting and two types of incising, one with a very precise tool, one with an extremely blunt tool, we're supposed to believe then that this is totally authentic. I have no idea. As I said, I would love this to be the case. I personally would rather find I was always looking for the burial place of James. I wanted to take a bulldozer and bulldoze the whole area up underneath the pinnacle of the temple ages ago to find James's burial place and this marker. But I never thought we would come upon an ossuary, and that makes me worried. The whole thing worries me because of these things. I guess if you know, I don't want to say I know too much. I think I know more than most. If you know too much, you worry more. If you know nothing, you don't worry at all. That's the problem. We've got a lot of people who never even heard of James before, so they're like in cloud cuckoo land. They're loving it, and that's good. But finally, look, it's all good for all of us, because if the people would come at this and get interested in James, then we all win. Because James is the most underrated, most marginalized character, and here he is suddenly on the front burner. Let's go and get interested in James. Let's not just use the thing to prove the existence of Jesus. If this turns out to be an authentic ossuary, all the more, all the better. But in the meantime, we've learned about a whole picture of the forgotten history of the church. We've challenged ourselves, we've extended ourselves, and people who are intelligent thinking people in the modern world are tired of just being fed pablum. They want to be extended. And everyone wants their life to be rich. They don't want to live a donut life. They want to think, hey, I can learn something in my life. It's not all pat, I'm going to learn in a catechism class. Let me be an intellectually modern person. That's been the problem of religion for modern people. It's only been relegated to unthinking people. And thinking people said, oh, I'm not religious. We all need to be religious, and this will allow us to get our teeth into a challenging problem. I hope that they do get into the James problem, but let's not just go around, did Jesus exist or didn't he exist? That's not the whole ball of wax.
Assume for a moment that it is the real thing. You know?
Yeah. Then you've got it. Then you're bingo. All the things they want to prove are proven.
Meaning what?
They want to prove the fact that they have a contemporary witness of Jesus from the 1st century. If this is authentic, they're home free. That's all. I don't, again, what these people have decided, whoever are involved in this, and I don't know if it's nefarious or it's just accidental. You know, sometimes these things happen and have an accidental momentum to them. But the way it appeared seems to me odd. I have heard rumors that it was being offered for sale around Jerusalem, and I've been told this by Israeli colleagues 2 years before without the second part. But these may just be rumors, and I don't want to spread rumors. But the way this appeared is extremely odd. But if it's authentic, and I can't imagine the second part is written the same time as the first, but if everyone agrees that it's authentic, you can take the proof of Jesus to the bank.
But do you think that after you've taken it to the bank, the fact is...
And the guy will also take his ossuary to the bank, too.
But after all that's done, do you think that one of the implications of this find would be that whether we want to or not, we will have found James, and therefore start...
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I think that the people who have begun to support this in religious circles, and I don't want to name any people, but that was the original thing, was, oh, we've got it now. This is what we've been looking for millennia. This is not the find of the century, you know. This is the find of the millennium, not the find of the century. You know, this is the greatest archaeological find of the last 1,000 years, if this is authentic. And, yeah, because then they'll show this relic more than the Turin Shroud, more than any other relic they have, because it's actually got Jesus' name written on it from the 1st century. This is the find of the millennium, and this young chap, this Israeli collector, maybe is a kind word. This Israeli collector who seems to say that he first got it when he was like Jesus teaching the Pharisees in the temple at 13, that he bought this object when he was below the age of, I don't know what, of majority anyway, since he says he bought it 25 years ago and he doesn't look much more than 40, so I don't know what age he could have been when he bought this, supposedly. In any case, this will be the find of, this will be everything.
Sorry, tell me again that this is like, if this is it, it's bigger than Turin.
If this is authentic, not a double inscription, not a second inscription added later, then it's bigger than the Turin Shroud. It's bigger than any relic they will have. I think what the people have done who are supporting this, whoever's behind it, they're willing to throw the towel in on James the brother. They'll accept James the brother now, which they didn't accept before. You know, before it was always, oh, when I wrote my book, oh, he's not a brother, he's a milk brother, he's a cousin, he's a half-brother. You know, oh, no, Jesus didn't have any brothers. Okay, that battle's lost. Give them the brother. We want the Jesus. We want the Jesus. If we can throw in the brother in exchange for the Jesus, we've got a great deal here. I think all the establishment groups have said, give us the Jesus, we'll accept the brother too. So they've thrown the towel in on the brother issue in favor of the higher issue, proving the existence of Jesus in the 1st century.
But do you think, unbeknownst to them, they're going to get the brother?
Well, they're going to get the brother, but it won't matter to them, because I said they're not interested in the brother. They realize the brother is a marginal thing, and they can always shove him back aside.
maybe they've opened up
a Pandora's box?
An ossuary.
Vote up a Pandora's ossuary. Yes, possibly, if people read books like mine, but as you said yourself, the 1,000 pages even daunted you, and you at least have some reason to read it and energy, but it takes 1,000 pages to go through these things in a non-superficial way. Yeah, if they read my book, it is opening up a Pandora's box, because James becomes the outstanding hero of the movement, and probably the leader of the Qumran community as well.
Tell me about this is the find of the millennium again, sir, if this is real. Just one more time.
Am I giving you some good stuff here?
Yeah, but I was on a wide shot. Just go, if this is real.
If this is real, then sure, this is the find of the millennium, maybe the 2 millennias, because this is an artifact that overarches all the artifacts. This is not someone's tongue, ear, finger, head, ankle, whatever, vertebrae. This is an inscription saying Jesus existed in the 1st century. That's why the 63 paleographic date is so important. And they knew him, and they cared about him, and he was important enough at that time to sign his name to the ossuary next to his unimportant brother. My point was always that, yeah, the brother was important in the 1st century, and he didn't need the extra part to tell us who he was, and people wouldn't have thought of putting it. People wouldn't have thought of putting, because Jesus wasn't so important in the 1st century to those people in Palestine. Jesus became important as the documents were written that made and magnified his importance into the superstar, the demigod, the God that we now, the man God that we now all recognize as the savior of the whole human race. But that didn't happen in the 1st century. The documents propelled that process forward.
But surely James, the tzaddik, Yaakov tzaddik,
Right.
thought that his brother was Mashiach.
I have no idea the relation. See, I don't know exactly who the brother was by that point. I go in my book about the 4 brothers. We know there were that Cleophas and Mary. If Joseph is the Hebrew name for Cleophas, okay, it's possible. That Cleophas and Mary, or that other character listed in the gospel lists, James, the son of, what's his name? Alphaeus, which is probably a garbling of Cleophas, had 4 sons. They had James, Simon, Jude, and Joses. I say we know who Simon is. I can document Simon. Simon is Simon Bar Cleophas, who's said to be the nephew. He's actually the 2nd brother. He's the 2nd successor to James in the early church. The 3rd, Jude, is Jesus' twin. He's Judas Thomas, Judas the twin, also called Thaddeus in gospel lists, also called Lebbaeus, seems to have evangelized northern Syria and Iraq, and this person, I think, was beheaded at some point. He may have been the Theudas in Josephus, who was beheaded. In any case, his descendants are still around when the Roman emperor Trajan is trying to round up Messianic claimants in the latter part of the century. The 4th brother, Joses, we don't know. Who is the 4th brother, Joses? That's just Jesus himself before Jesus became, distinguished from his brothers in the process of as I said, as the fathers became uncles, brothers became cousins, mothers turned into their own sisters, and Jesus turned into his own brother. Joses is the same person as Jesus. We don't have any information about that. Is the 4th brother. Now, that 4th brother, Joses, I don't know much about him. And he may have been executed very, very, very early on, and he may have been seen as this messianic individual executed in a very nasty way. I've covered all this in my book, but I don't know much more about Jesus than that, because the documents that we have, I don't think have been written in the interest of the Pax Romanum, Hellenized, Romanized, pacified.
Now, there's a tradition that...
These are all quasi-zealot leaders, Essene zealots.
There's a tradition that that James found the remains of the father of John the Baptist and Zechariah, the Pidyona Ben guy from Jesus. Anyway, that Theodosius or somebody, I don't know, that he was buried together with the... Yesterday...
Oh, what's his name? Those are late Armenian church traditions. They're interesting in terms of the burial tradition. I'm not familiar with those later traditions. I have to look them. That's the only interesting contribution that gentleman gave. He did give an interesting contribution to show the traditions regarding the burial, the takeover. I've always wondered why James was associated with the tomb of St. James in the Kedron Valley, the Beni Hezer tomb, which was a priestly tomb. All the pilgrims identified that as the tomb of St. James. I speculated in my book that, in fact, that may be the original of the story of the Jesus in the Holy Sepulchre, and that there was a rich man who had a tomb. And I go in very deeply how there were rich people from Adiabene who were very interested in the James approach. So all that is very unclear, very diffuse, hard to get a handle on, but there's some interesting points, but I wouldn't be able to give you any final conclusion regarding that.
Curiosity, why is it called Bnei Chazir? Is that
Who?
Bnei Chazir?
The Beni Chazir is on the inscription on the wall of that tomb.
But is that somebody?
It's a priestly course. If you look at the returnees on Ezra and
Sons of the Pigs.
I can't help that.
No,
It's
somebody's
yeah,
later
I
on
know.
that
No. If you look at the returnees under the different courses, Hezir is one of the courses of the returnees, and probably one of the high priestly families were members of that Hezir family. But I don't think they thought of themselves as pigs, and I think that's just an accidental,
And that tomb has been identified with James?
Pilgrims have always called that the tomb of St. James.
Right next to Absalom's tomb.
Right, and the tomb of Zechariah next door to that. Right, all those. But those were originally high priestly tombs of the Herodian period, ostentatious high priestly families. Now the revolutionaries might have said, I don't want to be vulgar here, the heck with you people, and kicked all their bones out when they took over all this kind of stuff, because they had no respect for these priestly families, particularly rich priestly families. You have a social revolution here, the poor against the rich. Josephus makes that quite clear. They burn all of the debt records. They kill all of the high priests. This is a social revolution, one of the first in history. The Tzaddik is behind it all, like the Ayatollah Khomeini in Persia. He doesn't fight. He doesn't have to kill anyone, but his spirit permeates the whole thing. That's why, to me, James is like the old man on the mountain. But they might easily have kicked all the bodies aside in those tombs and put their heroes in their place. And if James was one of their heroes, he would have maybe been transferred to there. But I'm not sure you had an ossuary. No one ever mentions an ossuary. It seems strange this ossuary should pop willy-nilly out of nowhere. And, where is the where? If this was the ossuary in the ground, was it piled in a rock tomb someplace? Where did they find this ossuary? Was it buried? Usually you didn't bury ossuaries. They were stacked someplace. Was it stacked someplace? Was it buried in the ground? Why is the back of this ossuary all worn away and the front of it looks fresh as a daisy? It has so many questions regarding this ossuary that I like that it makes James important and interesting. But am I, because of that, to be cynical and say, oh, that's good for me, good for my book, good for James? Or to be honest, we don't need James. We don't need an ossuary to tell us about James. We know James. We've been talking about his importance from the beginning. People maybe have just learned about him. So if the ossuary helps that, it's a good thing. But if the ossuary is being used to deceive people, I don't like any kind of deception of any kind. And I think there is something wrong here. And many others think that too.
Now the way this has come to the world was through a cover story in Bar. Well, what do you make of that?
Bar is a commercial magazine.
Herschel Shanks has been instrumental in bringing this story to the world.
Herschel Shanks runs a commercial operation centered around archaeology. He's very capable, very quick on the trigger, and knowledgeable in what is going to hit front and center, and he has a lot of power. He's a very good public relations man, and he obviously sees the potential in this, even though earlier he was not interested in James at all from what I could see, and having talked to him for 15 years before that, he had no idea who James was, and suddenly this appeared, and now he's Mr. James. So, okay, fine. But I think the commercial possibilities, from what I've been hearing from all the people involved in it, are quite staggering. As are the commercial possibilities in the resale of the $250 ossuary. since I understand it was insured for now $1 million or so dollars, a $250 ossuary should have only been insured for $250. That's all my insurance company would pay me for the car I bought for $250. My car company only pays me for what I actually paid for the car.
Well, obviously this has value more than $1 million.
Well, yeah, but no one knew it at the time. Anyway, these are things that are beyond my scope, but I would only go that these people are very savvy businessmen who are involved in production of a very glossy, impressive magazine that tries to keep one step ahead of where things are at. But I wouldn't depend on it for my scientific understanding of the universe.
Now, one last question. If Jerusalem wouldn't have...
Was that negative enough?
No, that's fine. But if Jerusalem wouldn't have fallen, would Christianity have evolved into something totally different?
Yes, absolutely. I actually, if Jerusalem had not fallen, I don't think there would be a Christianity. Because the Jerusalem center was taken away with the destruction of Jerusalem, which left the overseas centers free to develop their own ethos. And often these centers were people from Greek and other backgrounds who, and there's been a long tradition of Greek anti-Semitism long before what we were talking about here. There was hostility between Greeks and Jews in Alexandria, very extreme hostility that ended up in riots, and in the Trajan period ended up in the total annihilation of the whole Jewish community in Alexandria and the Delta, in basically a Holocaust. Tremendous tension between Greeks and Jews in Caesarea and other cities along the coast, and when the uprising occurred, all these cities took it as a signal to kill all the Jewish populations in those towns. And the Jews were not innocent in areas where there are Greeks in their towns, so there was a great hostility. So the fact that there is a latent anti-Semitism in the kind of presentation we have, and anyone who's fair-minded can see it, the Jews are presented as really nasty. The scribes and the Pharisees gnash their teeth. Roman centurions recognize the Messiah. Oh, Chorazin and Bethsaida, if the wonders that have been done here had been done in Lebanon and Syria, they would have belonged long ago. In other words, everyone gets the picture except Jews, Samaritans, the Good Samaritan, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole... Jesus is presented as not loving his countrymen much. Well, if he's not loving his countrymen he loves everyone but his countrymen. If he doesn't love his countrymen very much, how would they ever have been able to accept him as a popular Messiah in the first place? I think he was a popular Messiah in his time, whatever it was he represented, and that gainsays largely, with large crowds of people following him, that picture has come down and reflects the anti-Semitism of the Greco-Hellenized Roman Mediterranean, which is normal. People's attitude. Suppose you were getting a gospel written in Poland in the time of the Second World War. You could have, or in Nazi Germany, you could have gotten some very negative stereotypes of Jews in a gospel of that kind. So it depends on, we say the victors write the history. Unfortunately, they didn't expect the Qumran scroll time capsule. In there, the losers wrote the history. So we are blessed with a precious moment. I hope this sarcophagus enhances it. But no, there wouldn't have been a Christianity because the Palestinian Center would have existed. And the Palestinian Center is more this apocalyptic messianism that you get in the scrolls. It probably wouldn't have been a successful proselytizing activity because it wasn't able to morph and change and receive things like pagan practices such as communion, drinking the body and blood of the living and dying God, or later on Christmas trees or Easter bunnies or reindeer or totem animals or whatever you needed to go. Judaism was too rigid for that, and Islam is more like what a cosmopolitan Judaism would look like, and it's quite rigid.
Okay, is there something I didn't ask you that I should... Sorry, you want to ask something?
Yeah, one question.
I got to go in a minute. I got to meet some... Can I leave my bags here? Or how long are you going to be here today?
All day.
Okay, I can come back in a couple hours and get them? Okay.
What would it take for you to believe that this ossuary is authentic? Is there
Yeah, look at me.
Is there any evidence that you've seen or that could...
I could not believe this ossuary is authentic in its present form. There's only way that I could believe this ossuary... There's no way I can believe this ossuary is authentic in its present form. That it may have been written and that it is James's ossuary, that's possible. The only way that could have happened is if it was done in the 4th century. But our paleographers are saying it's not 4th century paleography. They may be wrong there. In other words, if the second part were put by pilgrims who actually found James's body, where it was buried, where they said it was buried, put it in an ossuary, or actually found the ossuary of Jacob, the son of Joseph, and then they wanted to tell their followers, yeah, you know who this is the brother of our Jesus. And by the way, there is a festival in Spain, in Santiago de Compostela, which has an ossuary there where the bones of James are worshipped, which is very similar to the kind of ossuary we have here. And the way that ossuary got to Santiago de Compostela, which became the center of the whole St. James crusading order, the way it got there was that pilgrims brought it there sometime in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries when Palestine was in chaos owing to the fall of the Byzantine Empire and the coming of the Arabs. So at that point gave pilgrims a chance to take relics out. I've always thought, first of all, I don't credit there's a second James. I don't credit that. The second James seems to be part of the multiplication of like-named people in the interest of moving people further away from the Messiah. Okay, so you could have had this ossuary end up in Santiago de Compostela, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised. My brother, by the way, is doing the visitor center there. He's a great architect. He's doing the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin now. He's doing the visiting center at Santiago, so there's sort of poetic justice there. So this could be authentic from a pilgrim, and maybe they left it in Palestine, maybe it was smuggled out to Spain. All those things are possibilities. I have no idea. That's the only way it could be authentic. Other than that, we have modern questions which the Israeli authorities would have to look into, and it's not for me to look into these things. I don't know which is correct. The deeply incised, perfect writing of the first part worries me because it's just too perfect. And that's what I wrote in the LA Times. An ossuary, an inscription that's just too perfect in all its parts, aimed at the modern believing audience, not what an ancient audience would have expected or been expected to write on an ossuary. That's all I can say about it. Can't do any more.
That was really
Talk, man.